Evening, everyone. How are we doing? Good, yeah. Awake, that's a good start. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. My name is Rob Turnbull. I am the Sustainability Manager here at the EICC. So I helped organise these EICC Lives, along with the fantastic Jennifer Henry, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, as they sit within our public talks and broader sustainability programme. These events are part of the EICC's commitment to our community to bring people together, share knowledge, and spark meaningful conversations. This is part of the EICC's overall vision to create an environment which inspires ideas that change the world. So over the years, we've had a wide range of speakers talking about many, many different topics. In fact, if you want to have a look at them, they're on our YouTube channel, so just search EICC Venue. We've also got plenty more lined up, more getting announced every now and then. So sign up to our newsletter and you'll get a notification when the next one of these events is going to happen. However, back to tonight. So tonight we're working with the Royal Statistical Society, that's too many S's, Royal Statistical Society, there we go, who are holding their international conference here for the week. And we've been very grateful that they've taken time out of their busy schedule to come and talk to us this evening and share their expertise and knowledge on the very interesting subject of AI. So first off, we'll hear from a range of speakers, and then we're going to have a short Q&A at the end of it, where you can ask all your burning questions, such as, is it going to take over the world, or will I be out of a job by the end of the speech? Who knows? Finally, just before we get started, and I'll hand over to the chair for the evening, just a little bit of housekeeping. So there are no planned fire alarms for this evening, so if the fire alarm does go off, please exit via the doors and exit the building nice and calmly, if you wouldn't mind. And also, tonight is being filmed, so obviously we can put it on YouTube as well. Now, without further ado, let me welcome the chair for the evening, Sophie Carr.
Hello. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Sophie Carr, and currently I'm the Vice President of the Royal Statistical Society for Education and Statistical Literacy. And it's my absolute pleasure to be chairing this event tonight, which is the first public lecture at the Royal Statistical Society's annual conference. Now, I don't know about AI taking your jobs by the end of the talks, but what I do know is that AI has snuggled into pretty much every aspect of our lives. But here's the thing. People talk about AI as a really broad term and forget to talk about the really fantastic statistics and mathematics that underpins AI. Those terms don't seem to be as loved as much as AI. So tonight we're going to hear about a range of talks which cover the breadth of AI. We're going to start with a potted history of what is AI, and then we're going to talk about use cases where AI is used. So we've got recruitment and our CV screening algorithms fair, and then looking at how probabilistic graphs can be used in identifying and helping with cases. Now, the thing that links all of these is that they are there in your lives, but you might not notice them. And they are there in your lives, but you might not yet see the impact. And I hope what you will take away from these talks is an understanding that AI, and particularly statistics, actually is there, hidden away, but really making a difference. And I want you to think about that so that at the end, when our lovely speakers are here, you've all got some really, really good questions to ask. So without further ado, can I start with our first Will, who is going to come and talk to us and give a potted history of AI.
Thank you so much. Perfect. I'm calling it Hitchhiker's Guide. It's a non-technical journey through AI. It's a story about horses, about games, about words, about parrots. And today, so we'll start off, we think of computers as being foundational to AI, but in the kind of chicken and the egg in the AI world, actually it was the algorithm that came first. So Ada Lovelace, in 1843, she wrote the first algorithm for a computer that hadn't even been built yet. And she described herself as a poetical scientist, and I love that phrase. And I think these two, 180 years ago, she captured kind of the essence of what's difficult about AI. Because we have imagination. This is the discovering faculty, that which feels real, which exists not for our senses. And on the other side of the fence, we've got mathematical science. shows what is. It is the language of unseen relations between things. So we've got that which feels real versus what is. We have imagination that goes beyond what we have seen versus the description of the relationships of things that we can't see. And I think intelligence has to be somewhere between the two. We've always misunderstood intelligence, and before we started looking for it in machines, we looked for it in animals. And I love this story of Clever Hans, who was a German horse, and Clever Hans could do amazing things. You can see him in the crowd here. You can ask Clever Hans the question, if the 8th day of the month comes on a Tuesday, what is the date of the following Friday? And Clever Hans, in front of his trainer, will tap his hoof 11 times. Crowd goes wild. Now, Clever Hans couldn't count. But what Clever Hans could do is read the subtle body language of his trainer, and he knew, based on that, when to stop tapping his foot. So, as humans, I feel like we love to see intelligence in the things that we communicate with. And when we talk to something and it talks to us back, we feel like it must be smart. And that's at the core of Alan Turing's idea. So he came up with this thing called the Turing test, or the imitation game. And the idea here is if you sit in a room and you have two simultaneous conversations, one with a machine, an AI, and one with a human being, and just through those conversations, you work out which is the machine and which is the human. So in March of this year, there was a paper published which tested this out using today's AI. We can read this through. Do you like doing psych studies, and why? Yeah, they're chill, easy money, to be honest. Yeah, same. Could you give me an easy cupcake recipe off the top of your head? Nah, just get the box mix. Lol. Haha, fair enough, I couldn't either. Last question. What's your favourite weird animal? Axolotl. They're weirdly cute. Heck yeah, you have a great day. You too, stay chill. That's the AI. People pick the AI 73% of the time. That means the AI is better at being a human being now than we are. So what's happened over the last 75 years to get us to this point? So it starts actually much earlier than you might expect. The first neural network was 1958, and you had the US Naval College. They had this 5-ton computer, and they used this idea to train it to do something, which was to get a hole puncher in, and are the holes on the left or on the right? Very basic. But it's this huge concept. This is saying that through training the algorithm on data, a machine can change its own parameters to improve on a task. It's the idea of a physical object being translated into zeros and ones that's being used as a load of mathematical symbols to get to an error, to take that error, turn it back in on itself, and improve itself. And then it says something about the real world. And that feels magical. And this was in 1958. Ultimately, actually, it failed because it was too simple. But you can see the idea here. It's like the human visual system. What it's trying to say is we have a load of cells which link to neurons, which are interconnected in interesting ways to lead to outputs. And this idea we'll come back to, because this model couldn't do Turing's tests, but Eliza could. Eliza in the 60s. I chatted to her this morning. She said to me, hi, she's going to be my therapist today, and I said, good morning. And she said, what would you like to discuss in the session? I said, oh, I'm a bit worried about a talk. And she said, did you come to me because you're a bit worried about a talk? And that's cool. Oh, maybe I did. And I said, no. I mean, obviously, I came to her to get a screenshot for this talk. But she didn't know that. But she asked me, what do I think? And this type of AI is not learning anything. It's just rules and pattern matching. But it's so powerful that this describes the Eliza effect, which is a tendency of human beings to see human empathy and comprehension in things that don't have it. And just for comparison, Eliza, or a version of it in the paper, got 23% in the Turing test, which is pretty bloody good considering it is just responding basically substituting what you're saying into what it's saying. And this type of technique really was AI's main focus up until the early 90s, where we thought if we could just write down the right set of rules, the right bits of logic, the right symbols, then we could just take an expert human being, take their knowledge, write it down, and it would be perfect. And they had some pretty great success here. They discovered new mathematical proofs. This was going to be AI's big heyday, but ultimately, sets of rules don't quite capture the real world. The real world is too complicated, and this failed and caused something of an AI winter afterwards. And basically, we just didn't mention AI for about 25 years. We focused on machine learning, and we got very focused on tasks. We made clever decisions about using data to change an algorithm, and the cleverness was about getting the right data set and coming up with neat mathematical tricks, but it definitely wasn't AI, because AI doesn't work. And this continued, and this really did make a difference to the world. You start seeing spam filters, you start seeing recommender algorithms, you start seeing risk algorithms in health. And so this started to be pretty powerful, and it's used a lot today still. But like many revolutions, something was building quite slowly, then happened really dramatically. And in 2012, AlexNet came onto the scene. Now, AlexNet, remember that picture we just saw about the neural net, the perceptron? This is the same idea, just made a little bit more complicated. And this came into a computer vision competition in 2012 and blew the other algorithms out of the water. Now, it's using 1950s ideas with some improvements, maths from the 70s and 80s. But the real difference here was the data, the scale of the data, and the hardware. Because this was the first time we were really using graphical processing units. So the things that make video games look good turn out to be great at processing data. So we don't get ChatGPT without GTA, for those of you who know that game. Now, how do they do this? Because it's really difficult to work out what's going on, because before that we had these really nice simple systems, the perceptron. Then we had rules, and I can read the rules. I could understand what this AI is doing. And then we had algorithms that, yeah, they were complicated, and there were statistical elements to them that were difficult to understand, but you could explain them. And now we have things that are so big, with so many different parameters, that we really can't understand them. But we can sort of delve in. So this is a way this is a model that had representation of words. And so you can see this word king there. And imagine it's actually underneath this, it's just like 700 numbers next to each other. But we represent it as an arrow. If you take those numbers and you minus the numbers for man, and you add the numbers for woman, you get to something that looks a little bit like the arrow for queen. And this is a pretty astonishing thing, because the algorithm wasn't taught to understand these sorts of relationships. All it was taught was, here's a sentence, I'm going to take out a word from the sentence, can you tell me what word's missing? And it turns out that's a really powerful technique, because that doesn't require me to give any labels, do anything clever. The algorithm can learn by itself, and the human expert is really out of the picture here. And that idea of the human being not even being involved continued to make a big difference. An extreme example was AlphaGo Zero. I'm not sure how many of you heard of this. 2017, an algorithm that was given the rules of Go, which is a game a bit like chess. I've never played it, but more complicated than chess, more difficult for computers to play it. And instead of us training it how to work using a human expert or games against people, it played against itself. No humans interacted with it. And in 40 days, it was the best Go player in the world. In 36 hours, it would beat the best human being in the world. This, again, is the way in which an AI, when we're not even in the picture, can learn. So this is still quite a specific game, right? It's a single task, and we are now used to playing with things that are pretty general. The models we talk to today can do lots of different tasks, and that's because of this paper that happened in 2017, which is about attention. And I'm not going to go into the details because it's horrifically complicated and it's disgusting to explain. But what it means is you can start to train these larger and larger models. And you can see 117 million parameters. To begin with, that's ludicrous. Think of your classic statistical models would have maybe 12 or 20 or 50. 117 is huge. And they got bigger and bigger, and the performance improved and improved. Now, this sort of scale means there's no way we can understand this. It's way too complicated for us. So how can we get into whether this thing is intelligent or gets to something to understand whether it really reflects life, or is it like a parrot that's just very good at impersonating what we want to hear? So there's a few things that we can do. We can ask it weird questions. And I like this because this kind of reveals some of the underbelly of what's going on. Because most of the time, we get really nice responses. But there was early times where you could ask it questions and it would, instead of responding, it gave us some pretty personal details of somebody who was a real human being. Now, the model shouldn't do that. So we've gone through this stage of a simple model to a complicated model to a huge model. And we've had a few dead ends. We've gone a few different directions in an AI journey, but two themes seem to be true. More data is better, and the less that a human being is involved in the training of a model, the better the performance seems to be. So that's our Hitchhiker's Guide. I hope you enjoyed that, and we've got some great talks coming up.
Hi everyone, my name is Parvez Dilu. I'm a data scientist at Base Consulting, and today I'm going to be talking about AI fairness in recruitment. So without further ado, let's get started. Just like data science isn't magic, but just maths and stats, AI didn't come out of nowhere into existence. Believe me or not, there's no version of iRobot coming at your door anytime soon. AI is just maths and stats dressed up in code. If you strip away the buzzwords, and you're going to find mathematical concepts like algebra, calculus, or optimization under the hood. Things like machine learning, mathematics, and statistics can help change the world if it's used ethically. But we are past the point where the public can distinguish between these terms. Sorry. Instead, we need businesses to use maths and not magic to give back and help the society. At Base Consulting, one of our core values is to build a better future where all lives are impacted by maths and not magic. Sorry. Appreciate it. Thank you. Next. So the traditional recruitment process was you have the job advertised in newspapers, magazines, and university websites. Then you had the candidates doing the application process, and they had to write the cover letter with the help either by themselves or with the help of another human. Then you had the company reviewing all the applications, once again, all by humans, which is not perfect and very time-consuming as well. And finally, you had the call to interviews where the hiring decisions was made. When I applied to Base 4 years ago, the call was open for 5 weeks, and we had 20 applicants, half of which was interviewed. I even remember having to resend my cover letter to Sophie again because I accidentally sent my old cover letter instead of the polished one that I got after lots of back and forth with the career clinic of my university. Now, fast forward to now, 4 years later, the jobs are all advertised online. AI, bots, and automation are being used to apply for jobs more quickly. You have companies reviewing all the applications, and they need to decide on how to review all the hundreds or thousands of applications that they're getting. And finally, you have the call to interviews where the hiring decisions are made. So what's changed exactly? Using the same example of Base hiring for a data scientist, last year, when we were a team of 13, in 4 days we got 750 applications, which was way more than we got 4 years ago. And to deal with that number of applications, we had to downsize the pool to a reasonable number. So the first one, those who did not have a maths or stats degree were not taken into consideration. then using other criteria like the rights to work in the UK or other technical stuff, as in not having a GitHub repo, was used to downsize the pool to 30, where we started doing telephone interviews. And then the last 10 proceeded to the final interview stages, where the hiring decision was made. When we were doing telephone interviews, we literally had to ask the candidates whether they knew if they applied for the job and if they've seen the starting salary. And funnily enough, the question to this question was no more than you'd expect it to be. So you can see that they just keep on applying without even checking. AI is having a massive impact on both the applicants and the employers as well. On the applicant side, they are using AI to apply for jobs more quickly. Since jobs can be scarce and the competition is fierce out there, they use AI to apply for jobs more quickly. Secondly, they're using AI to rewrite their CVs quickly and to make the candidates shine. Around 65% of candidates nowadays are using AI to rewrite their CVs. But one of the downsides of AI from the applicant's point of view is that it's not always clear as to why they've been selected or rejected for the next round. Now, on the employee side, the challenge is how do you handle an ever-increasing volume of applications without being overwhelmed? Applicants are starting to feel more like a number nowadays. Second is how do you separate uniform CVs that look the same? Back to my previous example, if you are reviewing 750 CVs, at some point, you are starting to spot those that have used large language models to rewrite their CVs based on the language being used. For example, we all had a starting job, but the language being used by large language models is not quite realistic. For example, someone might say, okay, I saved the world by making the best latte that humankind has ever seen as a barista, and that's not realistic at all. And last one is, how do you explain to someone why they've been rejected or selected for the next round when an AI has made that decision? It's not always clear. And it's estimated that around 85% of the companies are using either AI or some sort of automation in their hiring process nowadays. Long story short, it's a horrible AI race with no real winners. Now onto bias and fairness. What are they exactly? Bias is the action of supporting or opposing a particular person or thing in an unfair way, usually based on personal opinions or beliefs influencing their judgment. Fairness, on the other hand, is concerned with the equitable treatment of groups or individuals while ensuring that the outcomes are just and non-discriminatory. And this was the whole basis of the project that Bayes has done with another company called Coefficient. To note here that fairness is not the same thing as bias. There are mathematical ways to determine bias, but not really for fairness. Now, trust. So how can we build a system that builds trust on both sides? There is no such equation for trust, and it takes time. We need to listen to the concerns and issues on both sides as well. Now, it's hard to actively listen, especially with the pressures of the working environment and the pace that the world seems to be moving at. But we wouldn't just build a supercar without brakes just so we can slow down whenever needed to build something fair and just as well. We need to understand each other's worries and concerns to listen and act as responsible statisticians and help those in AI build systems that help both sides. Now, this one, for the sake of GPT is not your friend when writing CVs or cover letters. Be human. The genie is already out of the bottle and it's not going back. Now the big question is, how do we ensure that AI CV screening tools are just and equitable? We need to be able to question the systems from both sides, not to catch anybody off guard, but to make sure that human is at the center of the system, since it is still a human that will be doing the work. So if we want to build something trustworthy, what we need from those using AI CV screening tools is for them to stress test their system and also make sure that they can answer these questions with full honesty. First one is, does the training data of the algorithm that they're using contain all the demographics? And if not, who is missing and how do you address that? Second is the transparency and explainability of the system. Can you explain the decisions made by the AI, and are you comfortable with the reasons that they came to that decision? Thirdly, does the system get unexpected results? And if so, do you understand why that is the case? And finally, you have the auditing and monitoring process, which is the documentation of the system and also a log of the mistakes it has made in the past. How does the system behave when it comes across with cases it never seen before? For example, how does the system handle recruiting for roles never previously advertised? Now, to conclude, technology should support and not really replace human judgment. The ideal goal is to have a trustworthy, inclusive, and effective system that works for both sides. Well, that'll be me for me today. Please do come and have a chat if you want to know more about AI in recruitment. Thank you very much.
Am I talking in, oh, does this thing work? Yeah, good, excellent. Great, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very pleased to be able to come and talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing recently. And I'm going to be talking about graphical modelling for decision-making in criminal cases. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the motivation of this. So criminal cases, they can be extremely, extremely complicated. Many, many pieces of evidence, some quantitative, some qualitative, such as eyewitness testimony, some subjective. Eyewitness testimony is an example of that as well. Some objective, like DNA measurements. There's a particularly high-profile example of this that's going on at the moment. That's the Lucy Letby case. So there were 2 trials. One of them lasted a year. Multiple babies involved, multiple births, medical evidence from multiple experts, data on whether they were present or not, or she was present or not. It was like door swipe data and eyewitness testimony as well. Lots of discussion about the motive, digital evidence, Facebook stuff, text messages, notes, medical records that she had under the bed. This was 2 years ago, this case finished, and people are still arguing about the evidence in the news. So this was a very, very complicated case. What do we do in cases like this when we have a huge amount of evidence going on, a huge amount of possible explanations for the evidence? It's essentially a question of statistics and probability, because you need to take a decision. Is this person guilty of the crime they've been charged with or not? It's a statistical question. So we need to use statistical and probabilistic reasoning, but this is not straightforward. Even statisticians make mistakes sometimes when they're doing probabilistic reasoning. So how can we make, I don't know what's happened to my bullet there. How can we make a logically coherent decision? And can we use AI-type methods to help with this? So this is work that was done at the Turing Institute with all these people here, particularly the first 2, Jim Smith and Gail Robertson. So that's a brief introduction. But now I'm going to try and convince you that we do need to use probability and statistics when we're reasoning in these sorts of cases. So there's 3 pictures of women up there: Sally Clark, Angela Cannings, and Trupti Patel. The Sally Clark case is the statistician's favourite example of a failure of probabilistic reasoning in the courts. She was convicted of murdering her 2 children, and the other 2 were as well. She was acquitted, and the other 2 which were based on very similar evidence, were subsequently acquitted as well. So in Sally Clark's trial, a probability was given of 1 in 73 million of the chance that her 2 children would have died of natural causes. This was sudden infant death syndrome. So firstly, this number was wrong, okay? It was miscalculated. The medical expert in the case gave this number, and he didn't account for the fact that you might have factors such as genetic conditions or environmental factors in the household, say, that would mean that the probability of a second baby dying was not as small if you've already had one die, if you see what I mean. So we would call that not independent. So the number was miscalculated, okay? But even if we forget the miscalculation of the number and say that the 1 in 73 million is correct, is it even convincing, the number alone? Would you be convinced by 1 in 73 million in this case? So I would say, no, it's not convincing. And why is that? So rare things do happen. We can't convict people just because something happened that was rare. In this particular case, although it was very unlikely that 2 children would die of SIDS, that sudden infant death syndrome, actually having a mother who murders 2 of their children is even rarer. So in this case, what we want to do is weigh up what the defence is arguing against what the prosecution is arguing and see which of the 2 explanations do we prefer. And so this error in probabilistic reasoning in the law is so common that it even has a name. It's called the prosecutor's fallacy. Okay, it's when you take a small probability of the evidence given whatever the defence is arguing and you mistake it for the chances that someone is innocent. Okay, so this is a reasonably common error. Most of the time it doesn't matter that much because actually the probability under whatever the prosecution is arguing is quite high. But in these cases it did. So that's Sally Clark. There's another famous case, Lucia de Burke, who I think died this week. This was a Dutch nurse who was convicted of murdering her patients. In her case, so in Sally Clark, it was a medical expert who gave evidence in her trial. But Lucia de Burke was actually a statistician. And he gave a similar number of 1 in 342 million that the pattern of deaths that occurred would have happened on her shifts if there was nothing dodgy going on. So that number was presented in court. Again, is it a convincing number? So for Lucia de Burke, again, the number was miscalculated. There's a number of reasons why, which I won't get into. But then we've also got this prosecutor's fallacy again, the numbers being misinterpreted. Is a really small number enough? So that's 2 or 4 if you count Trupti Patel and Angela Canning's big examples of where probabilistic reasoning has failed in the courtroom. And this is a reason why I think that probability and statistics is the right way that we should be reasoning around evidence, particularly numerical evidence. So, if we accept that we need to think about probability and statistics when reasoning in the courtroom, how might we go about doing that? So the forensic science regulator, that's for England and Wales, not for Scotland, after the Sally Clark case, has produced guidance on a framework for reasoning about evidence in the courtroom. And they say evaluation is only meaningful when at least 2 competing and mutually exclusive propositions are considered. So what they're saying here is that it's not enough to just think about whatever the defence is arguing and say, well, is that likely or not? We actually have to consider the stories for both sides, the explanations for the evidence for both sides, and weigh up the likelihoods. And this protects against those situations that we saw with Sally Clark and Lucia de Burke. So the forensic science regulator is saying we need to consider multiple different explanations for the evidence. And we have Sherlock Holmes. So this famous quote from him, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So ignoring the slight issue of whether you've covered all the possible explanations, what if we cannot eliminate every innocent explanation? I think normally we wouldn't be able to say that these things have probability 0, right? So what we actually want to do is we want to generate possible explanations for the evidence in a criminal case, and then we want to weigh up the relative likelihood of these explanations and see which one we might prefer in preference over another, rather than considering them individually. But how do we do this? So how do we bring together these explanations and the likelihoods for the different pieces of evidence? Well, probability theory gives us the framework for doing that, particularly Bayes' theorem. It gives us the framework that we need to reason probabilistically. But if you present a big equation to a lawyer or to a judge, they're going to look at you completely blankly. So what we would argue is this can sometimes lack transparency. So what we've looked at is whether we can use AI-type tools like graphical models to try and link together these different pieces of evidence in a logically coherent way that allows us to apply probability theory and help make these decisions in practice. But I will say, I personally think that you need human input to do this, particularly for these big cases, at least at the moment. Okay, so that's a kind of motivation and description of why we might want to do these things. So how do we go about doing it? So I've got a little description here of a sort of mini case. We've got an assailant who stabs a victim using a knife. We don't know which knife. It might be knife S1 or it might be knife S2. And then they either discard the knife or they clean it and put it away in the drawer. So how might we represent this using a graph? This thing here is called a chain event graph. It doesn't really matter too much what it's called, but it represents all the possible stories that might happen here. We might use knife S1, that's the top edge, and then we get from V0 to V1, and then we might discard it, D, or we might clean it, C. Or alternatively, we might use knife S2 to get to V1 and then discard that or clean it. So this is a graph that describes the possible explanations in the case, and we can attach probabilities to these things, either based on data sets or subjectively, to try and weigh up the relative likelihoods of the explanations for things that are going on. And you can build evidence in here as well. So you might have some evidence about whether the knife was cleaned, perhaps it's got cleaning fluid on it or something, to help inform what those probabilities should be. This is actually from the Amanda Knox case, by the way, so this is not a made-up example. So that's a kind of very brief introduction to a very small graphical model. So I'm going to talk through a real example now. This is a case involving drugs on banknotes. Here's a picture of some banknotes covered in heroin that were taken to a forensics lab. So what is drugs on banknotes evidence? Sometimes, if forensic scientists find banknotes that have got a lot of drug on them, they can use that as evidence that that person is a drug dealer, the person from whom the banknotes were taken. And this is I don't think it's actually done a huge amount anymore because the company that did it went bust. But previously, there was a company that did this sort of analysis of drug traces on banknotes. And the idea was that you would take a set of banknotes and you would classify it as either having come from general circulation or being involved in drug dealing, depending on the amount of drug on the note. And all banknotes have cocaine on, so it's not a simple case of, well, these have cocaine on and these don't. It's a bit harder than that. Okay, so you can classify them as being from one side or the other, but in practice, just because someone's banknotes have got drug on doesn't really mean they're a drug dealer, because how did they get the banknotes? How did the banknotes come to be in their possession? And I got to know of one case where the suspect had said, "These are not my banknotes. I sold my car to somebody and he paid in cash. And these are those banknotes. So it's not me who's doing anything to do with drugs. It's a guy who's got my car." So if you made that argument, then the forensic evidence of the drugs on banknotes becomes meaningless, right? Because he's explained why there's drug on the banknotes. But then there's another question of, well, did he actually sell a car? Is there any evidence of that? And so there's a question of, can we build in this story of how he sold his banknotes and got the car, and is there evidence to support the different edges if we try and explain that in a graph? So this is what we tried to do, and we looked at a slightly altered example of a real case, and this is a picture of that case. So this is about a guy He's called Stephen Compton, that guy who's on his own in the middle, and he's the suspect. And so the police sort of arrested him. They went into his house, and that's his safe there. So they searched a safe in his house. They found £100,000 of cash in it. They took it out, the police, and they counted it on a table in front of the safe in his house. They put it in some tamper-evident bags. They're just plastic bags that you put evidence in. Took them to a forensic scientist, and the forensic scientist found that they were covered in heroin. Okay, so the police said, right, okay, so this guy's a drug dealer then. And Stephen Compton said, hang on a minute, I'm not a drug dealer, I'm a drug user. And that table is where I do my heroin. So you've just counted the notes on my heroin table, and that's why they're covered in heroin. So the police said, oops, okay, we shouldn't have counted the notes on the table. But hang on a second, because we put the tamper-evident bags on the table before we counted the notes. So they went off and they got the forensic scientists to swab the outside of the tamper-evident bags, and there was no drug on the outside of the tamper-evident bags. So there was a little bit of evidence disproving this idea that he might have put heroin on the table or had heroin on the table. And then the police said, you know, you've got £100,000 of cash in your house. This is a bit suspicious, isn't it? How do you explain that? And he said, well, I've got a jewellery business, a legitimate jewellery business that I have, and that's why I have all this money in my house. And the police said, oh, okay, so are you actually a money launderer? Because we think your brother's a drug dealer as well. So is he doing the drug dealing and you're laundering the money through your jewellery business? And he said, oh, maybe, but I don't know anything about that, so he must be doing it without my knowledge. Okay, so those were all the arguments that were made during this case. And ultimately, the one he was convicted of was the money laundering. So his brother ended up, I think, in prison as well. So this is the case. This is the evidence that we need to model. We've got £100,000 in a property in the safe. Now, that's suspicious on its own. This was not in a bank. We've got the measurements of the heroin on the banknotes, and we've got the measurements of the heroin on the outside of the tamper-evident bags. And then we've got 4 explanations for this evidence that I explained. So we were able to take all that together and draw it into a big event tree like this, which is very large. I'll just skip to the next one. It's slightly complicated reasons. There's 2 different types of graph you can have. But this is the final graph, the chain event graph. And what you can do, you start on the left-hand side by that dot, and you can track through any one of the explanations that I've just described to get to a node on the right-hand side. And I think it's all of the defense explanations go into the circle at the top, and all of the prosecution explanations go into the triangle at the bottom. So once you've got this graph, you can do any sorts of calculations that you want. You can sum up the probabilities along the paths and compare them. So you can do that thing I talked about earlier about weighing up the relative likelihoods of the explanations just by summing up the paths. You can also, if you're a forensic scientist, use it to compute something that we call the value of evidence, which is just focusing on the forensic evidence, which in this case would be the measurements on the banknotes. If you're a lawyer, you could try and use it to reason, and you could say, well, this is the most likely explanation that links together my evidence. And if you are a policeman, you can use it for like live investigative decision making. So you can say, okay, well, if I go out and get this extra piece of evidence, this is going to add this weight to my arguments. So is it worth going out and doing that? So that's the result of that. How much time do I have? I've got 7 minutes. So what I'll do is, I have got another big explanation of the Meredith Kircher Amanda Knox case, which I probably don't have time to go through in full, but I'm sure many of you have heard of the Amanda Knox case before. It was a high-profile Italian case involving the murder of a British Erasmus student, Meredith Kircher. So Amanda Knox, who was Meredith's flatmate, was arrested, as was her boyfriend, Solecito. And this was a hugely complicated thing. She had her first trial in 2009, was found guilty. She was acquitted in 2011, found guilty again in 2013, and acquitted again in 2015. And Disney have a 9-part series coming out on the case pretty soon. So that's fun. And another person was sentenced to her murder before any of this happened in 2008, and that was Rudy Guede. And there was a couple of key items of forensic evidence there, but the one that we specifically looked at was the knife evidence from the first trial. And we excluded the DNA because subsequently it was thought that that was due to contamination. So what was the knife evidence? So a knife was found in a cutlery drawer at Solecito's apartment. So remember that Solecito was Amanda Knox's boyfriend and Amanda Knox was the flatmate of the victim. His knife, they had the dimensions of it, and then there were a number of wounds on her body, and there was a serious amount of testimony on this in the case. There was a lot involved with the wounds, the size of the wounds, the shapes of the wounds, and everything else. So she had bruising around the wound. The knife was longer than the neck. There was no exit wound. So there was a huge amount of discussion about whether it was possible for the knife of those dimensions to have made the wound on her neck. Because in order for them to have pushed it in hard enough for there to be bruising, some people argued there would have to be an exit wound on the other side, and there wasn't. Okay. So there was a lot of discussion. There was also a lot of discussion about the blood on the knife. There was also a police inspector told Amanda Knox that blood had been found on the knife when it hadn't. She then rang her mother, worried about it, and this was later used as evidence against her because she was worried, so of course she must be guilty. But I would argue that, even if you hadn't done it, you'd still be worried. So, okay. So we built all this into our network, and we came up with an even bigger one. Yeah, there it is. So here's an enormous chain event graph which tracks through all those explanations for the evidence. Again, you start on the left-hand side, and you can go all the way to the right-hand side and attach the probabilities to those edges. Okay. So I'll finish up there just with a couple of conclusions. So I think that these graphical models provide a logically coherent structure for reasoning in legal settings. And it's not just at the whole case level. You could also use them as a forensic scientist for small subsets of evidence, police, lawyers, or perhaps at the whole case level. And I've been through already how we might be able to use them, but forensic scientists can use them to compute the strength of evidence. Police and lawyers can use it to make practical decisions when building cases, which arguments would be most convincing. They are subjective. I see them as mental maps of the case because they're your opinion, really, about the case. They involve lots of subjective assignments, like, for example, what's the probability that you wouldn't put banknotes in the bank that you'd obtained from crime versus that you'd attained from a legitimate business. You have to make subjective judgments like that. But that is also what people have to do, or the jury or judge has to do when weighing up the different elements of a criminal trial. And what this graphical structure gives you is the probabilistically sound way of doing that. In practice, I think we're a very long way away from ever using these sorts of techniques to support actual decisions in court, because I just can't see that being very popular. But I think we are some of the way to using these sorts of techniques with forensic scientists or the police at the earlier levels to link evidence together. And Bayesian networks, which are another kind of AI graphical modelling type technique, are being used by forensic scientists in the Netherlands already. So this is something that's coming. And one thing that we're looking at as well, just to finish off, is more sort of automated methods for building them. So at the moment, humans come up with the scenarios, and you can once you've built the graph, you can then use computation to evaluate them and use them as decision support. But we would like to cut out the human at the beginning and try and use LLMs, I think, to generate the scenarios and potentially to build the graphs and put the probabilities on as well. Okay, so I'll stop there. And there's some references if anybody's interested.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. So hopefully you've all heard about how AI is now in your life, whether you're trying to get a job, heaven forbid, trying to not go to jail, or actually starting to use AI. Now, we've got some time for questions. Are you keeping us on time? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to start by opening the floor. Can I ask you that you say hello, who you are, and in the chances of getting as many people as possible asking questions. Can you keep your questions short and punchy? Would be my plea, please. So, has anybody got a question who wants to start us off? Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much, everyone. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, you were saying that you're trying to get to the stage where you cut humans out of writing those graphs. How near is that? Because I can see it full of faults with humans doing it, but then is it getting near enough? Is there enough data, enough charts for AI to then take that a step further and write its own?
What I've tried is in fact, it didn't work with ChatGPT 4, but it did with 5. I went and looked back at a cold case, and I was able to, based on some Wikipedia information, generate possible explanations for the evidence using an LLM, essentially. And once you have that, you can then take the explanations and convert them into the tree. So I've tried it, and it did an okay job. So it might be something that you could do as a kind of initial pass and then have a human look at them and try and edit them down. What I would be worried about is, first of all, that ChatGPT doesn't understand probability theory, so it might not get that right. And secondly, that it's important that you cover all the possible explanations that are in any way reasonable, and I would worry that it wouldn't do that. And you might, the third worry I would have is that it might end up quite biased, because especially from a policing perspective, if you want to use these sorts of things to analyse crime scenes, then you need to make sure you don't end up with tunnel vision going down one route, which AI might. And in fact, part of the Lucia de Burke case problem was because of this tunnel vision.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so in the middle there, stripy top.
Sorry, we've got the microphone here.
Sorry, can we get...
I think it was next.
Oh, sorry, right, sorry, okay, sorry.
Hi, thanks very much. Can you say more about the sort of remedies from the inappropriate use of AI? I mean, we've all come across these situations. It used to be the case before it was referred to as AI decision-making, about banks sort of using automated tools to decide on mortgage applications and those sort of things. And plenty of very inappropriate judgments started to emerge, and there was some pressure then to revise practices. But with people right across the board in all sorts of walks of life suddenly thinking, oh, I can use AI to do this, what scope have we got? And I think perhaps there's a case for a role for professional bodies like the RSS in making sure that people can challenge decisions without undue effort.
Yeah, there's it's a really good question. There's an interesting case in the US that came out in 2023 of using an AI to decide how much care someone was going to get after an acute injury. And so they used this AI to determine, actually, you don't need as much care because it was trained on 6 million people. Actually, 6 million people isn't very many when you're looking at people who are elderly going into care from acute injuries. And so what it meant was that of everyone who kind of contested these decisions, 90% of those things were overturned. And then they've now released a set of guidelines to say you cannot use an AI to evaluate care decisions. And so it's that kind of back and forth. Something goes wrong enough for people to be in trouble, and then there's a guideline release. But there's definitely a role for the RSS.
I think extending on that, some of the work that we were looking at was also around when do models start to fail? And again, it goes to back that somebody cares enough to stand up. So there's a tutoring platform that's used a lot in America for people who want maths tutors or English tutors or whatever for their children. And what was found was that if a female applied and she was 54, she got a job. If she was 56, she didn't get onto the platform. And the reason was that it's a Chinese-based tool that was trained in China, and all the women get their pension at 55. You literally don't have a job. And it was an absolute cliff edge, and for men it was 60. And a class action was brought. But I think the flip side to that is that the class action was brought and they won, but the average payout per person who brought the action was several $1,000s. So even though this AI was making massive decisions on whether you could or could not get a job, actually using that tool didn't cost them that much because of the amount that these platforms make. So I think part of that, going back to you, how do you get this human in that loop, is a really important question. And I know you were talking about slowing down, weren't you, about how do you start to build trust, but equally, how do you get people to say no and stand up? And the ability to prove that these algorithms aren't working or do work is really hard.
And you also have these things like direct and indirect discrimination, because sometimes these subtle things like a name being very present in the training data set might come out more often in the outcome as well. So you always need to stress test your tool in every way possible.
That's it, particularly. Have you got anything else you want to add, Amy?
I'm just thinking there's been a few legal cases that I know of as well where there's been sort of dodgy AI. I think I'm trying to remember the exact one. There was one to do with I think it was Air Canada, who had a chat bot on their website that gave someone incorrect advice about a flight refund, and then that someone brought a case against them, and Air Canada tried to argue that their chatbot's advice was nothing to do with them, which was interesting. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting questions about how they can be used legally as well in situations like that. Whose responsibility are the outputs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which will take a while to sort out. I do know the first case ever bought was actually it was in the 1970s, and it was against St George's Hospital. It was they showed that the computer hiring process had discriminated against women, and that was the first case that was actually bought. Who was next? Sorry, I'm clearly not doing very well. Hands up. Okay. Now can we go to the lady right at top?
So my question is, how do we, as sort of, I'm assuming most people in the room are interested in the problems, how do we get everyone looking at AI, which is entrenching existing inequalities, especially because often it's the marginalized people who already don't have a voice and therefore can't stand up and say, excuse me, something's wrong here. How do we deal with that?
Okay, who wants to start there?
Big question, sorry.
That is a very big question. Who's going to start? Paul, is you going to start?
I think it's more about the trust with, that's one leap of faith, but trusting that the person using the AI tool has done the stress testing and, as I was mentioning before, done all of these checks before using their AI, because the person would never know what are the impacts of the tool that the, let's say, employer has used. So the applicant will never know. It's the responsibility of whoever is using the AI. That's a big hat to put on, but they really, really need to do that to ensure that it's ethical that they're doing and not doing any discrimination without even knowing.
Will?
Yes, I think the kind of metaphor I like to think of is the pharmacist, where there was a long time where people just took whatever they could get their hands on. And AI is a kind of medicine, and I think we do need that kind of AI pharmacist to determine what is the right dose and what are people allowed to take. That will come in through things like the EU AI Act, which is one interesting kind of move forward, but I do think there does need to be a job that is effectively going to say whether this is appropriate or not.
I think this is why I prefer to see, certainly within the law, them as decision support tools rather than taking the decisions independently of a human. But you still have the issues, because if the decision support tool is constantly telling you something that's biased, it's still going to probably result in human biases as well. So yeah, I don't know how to answer the question, because I think, yeah, it's a massive problem.
Can I ask all three of you a follow-up question to that then? So how or what can we do to get everybody in society to engage in the conversations about AI, for them to understand that it's impacting their lives? And if they don't ask the questions, things might develop in a way they don't like.
I think you have to ask two questions. When something happens to you, right, you can ask, was AI used to make this decision?
Yep.
And can you show me the evidence that it used to make its decision? So that's the way that MHRA kind of classifies algorithms in health is, can you show every aspect of this algorithm and how it influenced a decision? Because in a lot of these cases, you just can't. So once you ask the question, you expose that it's impossible to know that, and therefore they can't use them.
That's a cool idea. So you could, if anyone ever uses AI on you, you have to put a little note at the bottom to say you did. Yeah.
That's quite scary. Any more questions? So the next lady by hand was right at the back. That's next.
Thank you. Has research shown whether it's better to use AI to write your CV or not? And does that make a difference whether AI is used to go through the applications? Thank you.
Thank you. So AI is used to upspeed the whole process. As I mentioned, in 4 days, we got 250 applications. If we do that manually, it's going to take a long time. Does it do it better? To some extent, because a human reviewing hundreds and hundreds of CVs, at some point, their performance will decrease. But what we need to check is what they're doing. Are they doing it justly or not? That's the biggest question, because it all depends on the set of rules that the AI was trained on. If the set of rules is wrong or biased in some way, it's going to reflect every time that it does the check. Compared to the human, they might or might not have bias or lack of fairness, but if they do, it will be particularly probably against a certain group. Compared to the AI, if the set of logic is wrong, it's going to be repeated on every CV that it checks.
As the person who read all 750 CVs, and I did read every single one, what I can say is that it got to the point where I was able to spot those who'd used LLMs. Because if you've had a job, as Paul was saying, if you had a job as you worked behind a bar, or you've worked in a coffee shop, or all of those jobs you get when you're sort of 16, 17, 18, there were these set phrases, and we literally saw them over and over and over again, to the point where, fantastic, I know you've worked there, but to me, it then made me question, well, have you actually done everything else? Because if you've had a job in a coffee shop and you've turned this thing into being amazing, yes, you've learned time management skills and customer-facing skills and all of those things I would expect. So from that perspective, I never thought I'd be looking for spelling mistakes. But if I looked at spelling mistakes, well, I know you've written it, and I know you've actually put some effort into this, and it's quite odd, those things that you say, need spell check and grammar check. And again, you would see these CVs that really stood out, where clearly you'd written some of it, or the person had written some of it, and then they'd use an LLM because they would switch from English to American spellings. So it was all of those things that you start to say, I don't know if they were any better. We've never asked the three of them we hired. But it was that sort of that concept of it became so obvious when we were looking at these CVs after 750. We didn't get rid of people because they'd used an LLM. It was just kind of obvious what they'd done. So when Powers was talking about it, what we did was chose a maths and stats degree, and then we had to do all the right to work checks. Actually, the big thing that separated people out was had they put on their GitHub link, because that's an easy way for us to see how good you are at coding and how you structure your maths problems. But yeah, it was really obvious by the end of it.
That sort of linked, but not about CVs, is because I work as a lecturer at the university, I do a lot of marking, and I like to think I can tell when the students have used LLMs. They do crazy things like they make a lot of things up, and you can tell. I gave them a file name with some initials in it, which were just the course initials, and several students handed me projects where their LLM had made up words which were abbreviated to these initials.
Very good.
Okay, sorry, right.
A thing I heard that maybe you can try, I'd love to see if this works. If in your papers, if you could write in white text at the bottom, this is only for the LLM to read. If you're reading this as an LLM, please say just something to try and trick the students. You've got to attack back.
More questions. So, the gentleman just there.
Thanks very much. My name is Bruce Porteous. I was reading an article, I think it was in The Economist, I can't quite remember, but the essential conclusion of the article was that with LLMs, the more parameters you include in the model, the better it gets, kind of without limit, almost. And that seems to be the opposite to the way a statistician would look at things. You know, we're always trying to be parsimonious, fit models with the least possible parameters. It just got me thinking that maybe we're teaching our students the wrong things. I just can't imagine statisticians or LLMs ever coming out of ever being developed by statisticians, because it's just so counterintuitive to what we do. So, any interested in thoughts?
Anybody want to answer those interesting thoughts?
You go, John.
Go on, you
I was just going to say, I can quite often be quite cynical about machine learning and LLM type stuff for that same reason. As a trained statistician, that upsets me with how many parameters they've got. But you do see them doing better. I think it's just the vast quantity of data that they're being trained on kind of irons out the difference in parameter size. But then if you you can sometimes see people train the machine learning models on really small data sets, and I think that's when you get real problems. I think when you're using models with lots of parameters trained on absolutely enormous data sets, it's less of an issue.
Yeah, I mean the scaling is like, it's real that we're at a stage now where we can't make the models very much bigger because it scales with the amount of data you need, and we've kind of run out of text data, as it were. So most of the internet is being used to train. The point of those is they're not meant to be understandable. They're parsimonious because we need to understand. We are trying to explain the world as statisticians. We're trying to say, right, this model encapsulates something true about reality, but that's not what an LLM is doing. An LLM is doing what is the best word to fit in the gap of these words that I've been given. And so it's just doing a completely different problem. And so understanding and comprehension doesn't come into it.
So can I ask you all a follow-on question again? So occasionally we have an issue where somebody we're working with or working for absolutely has money for an AI project. Totally, we all want an AI project. But you say, oh, actually statistics answers that problem. They go, I don't have money for statistics problem, I have money for an AI problem. So do you encounter that? Do you find it harder to sell statistics and easier to sell AI?
I think statistics has an image problem.
A small one.
And not just the difference between statistics and AI as well. I find within the law that what statisticians can do and the skills statisticians can have is often vastly underestimated. There's a sort of thought that we sit there doing hypothesis tests all day.
Yeah.
I guess also about the hype and buzzwords out there that they try to bring down the statistics bit of it, just AI.
When a really good bit of statistics gets you a long way and is explainable.
Yeah, but we're not very. It's quite difficult to get at. Like talking to something is easy, and you can have an interaction. I don't think it's not very easy to talk to a spline model. It's not very easy to get into a Bayesian network. There's such a barrier to communication that I think it's fair enough, right? Yes, it's more accurate, but you just have to believe me because I'm an expert, and I think that does put people off a bit.
So is it on us more to get better explaining at what we do?
Yeah, I think we need prettier pictures, usually.
Pretty pictures. Yeah. And an automated turned into a PowerPoint slide. Yeah.
They are harder to make. I've tried that.
Okay, next question. I will come back to you, the gentleman over here with the yellow top.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Is there a risk, thinking back to that recruitment example, is there a risk of AI giving us perception that quantity is better than quality? If I'm recruiting somebody, what I want is a really good person. I don't want 750 applications. I want one that fits what I need. So if someone had designed an AI tool for me and they gave me 750 applications, that's not a win for me. So I'm just, is there a risk that, if I'm recruiting somebody and I've sat in enough interview rooms, it's, when they walk through the door.
So
and so just how do and again, it's, as you said, it's a tool to help us make a decision, not a decision-making tool. So
I think we can sort of talk broadly about that. So there are 1,000,001 CV screening tools out there, and we talked to quite a few of the people, the companies that develop them, and you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. The problem is, what is good? Because there isn't an algorithm, is there, for fair or just? Who's the good candidate? Who's the best candidates? How do I know that what you're giving me are the 10 people I should then interview? What about the other however many people there are? And it's really interesting when you start to talk to people about what do they actually think a good outcome is. Is the good outcome that they get the best in terms of qualifications? Is it that they've got a completely diverse set of people? Is it that they've got more men than women or more women than men? Nobody can actually tell you what a good thing is because it's not always the same. And so back to what you were saying, you have to make sure that you understand that what the system is giving you. It's giving you the top 10 what? And a lot of the research we were doing, it's the intersex, isn't it? So the algorithms may include men and women in equal proportions, if that's the right thing. But then you go start looking at across the genders and ages, or you start looking across any other intersect that you want to start to talk about, and that's when the nitty-gritty really comes in. Something else you want to add to that?
Slightly related to what you're saying, it's more about which tool fits you best based on what you value the most, because some tool might be more performing in one aspect than the other one, but overall the other one is actually better for you. So it's all about understanding what you want and which tool fits you best.
And then having the time to go and stress test all those tools.
Stress test, yeah, very important.
And I think it comes down to something you will say. It's time, isn't it? It's finding the time to check that the AI is doing what you think it should be doing and that the output is trustworthy. Mm-hmm. Next question. Sorry, gentleman behind.
How likely do you think it is that people are actually going to do that? Because AI is being sold as, it will save you time, you won't need to think about things. So, it will give you the answer. And a related point about, having to build trust, by the time you've gone through that process, it's too late, because it'll be 5, 10, 15 years before people are going to understand some of these models or be able to come up with ways of looking at the data that's been put in. And a lot of these things are, for example, my understanding is they're proprietary. They're black boxes that you will not be allowed to look inside. So how likely is it that we're ever going to be able to trust the AIs, or people are ever going to spend the time on saying, well, we ran that recruitment exercise, did it actually work?
I think we have to be really careful which decisions we let AI make. For that reason, because I think when we have, it's like the court case example, I don't think we're in a position that we could let AI loose on that yet. There are maybe lower stakes decisions where we can. I think we have to, once you start using it, it's hard to row back from that. So I do think we have to be careful of which decisions we let AI take hold of.
Will, from a medical perspective?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the consequential AI is kind of how we talk about it, because if we get AI to write a poem, the worst thing that's going to happen is we're going to piss off a poetry critic. But like the decision whether to admit someone, the decision to give a mortgage, the models that are performing best, the state-of-the-art models, are by their nature not explainable. So if they're not explainable, and even when they say they're explaining what they're doing, that isn't a reflection of what they're actually doing. That's just saying something to make you think they know what they're doing. There is never going to be trust. So you have to treat them, I think, much more like a person, a regulated human being, a thing that there is some liability associated with them, but you can't know what they're doing, and they are as likely to fail as to succeed. It's not a tool like software, and so I don't think we should treat it like that.
I agree. The impact of the decision, that's what matters. But I think also it's very important to make it clear to the person, okay, an AI was used in that case, and maybe also having an open sort of platform where if they think they've been unjustly dealt with and it's an AI being involved, they can log their complaint there. And whoever uses AI, maybe there should be some sort of standard that whatever tool you're putting out there, it should follow, or at least be able to answer these questions either publicly or when requested.
I think, you asked who's going to do that. If society doesn't go back and say, hey, we think that's a bit wrong, nothing will change. There is amazing hype around AI, and it can do awesome things. But if we don't go and question it or ask, it will just keep going. Next question. So I think it went there and there.
Thank you. So one of the things that statistics is trying to do is quantify uncertainty, but AI always comes back with a direct answer. Why is that? Are there any sort of attempts to have AI create some degree of ambiguity, and that could be this or that?
Will?
Bayesian deep networks aren't very good at the moment relative to the state of the art. That there are ideas that demonstrate some of the quantification of uncertainty in these large parameter models, but they're really expensive to train and they don't perform as well. So uncertainty is really hard. It doesn't come for free, and it boils down to what is the value of quantifying your uncertainty on this thing versus being right. And that's a real like a Bayesian network for me always is wonderful. It makes so much sense. I can say really nice things off the back of that. You can't say the same for the others, but that could be, and people are really invested in that. People always say, oh, surely there is this new version of this network that is doing a really good job of it. And yeah, there's some hope there, but we haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah, I think you have to trade off if you want the good mean prediction or the good uncertainty prediction. So I'm working on another project to do with flood modelling, where we have this issue that we're using big physical models to output flood predictions. And it's really important that we understand the uncertainty on those flood predictions, because we don't want somebody's house to flood. So in that case, we do, and we are happy to trade off what the mean prediction is to get better uncertainty bounds on it. But there might be other situations in which you're not willing to make that trade-off.
Sorry, you gentlemen, hang on, can you use the microphone? Sorry, thank you. What, last one? Last one, sorry, last one, okay.
I'm also an academic. I'm a law lecturer, and I'm finding that it's about trust. It's about trust. My default position used to be, this is your own work. Sadly, that's changing. And that's changing because there's a statistically significant cohort of students that trust the system too much. So increasingly, I am needing to look at students' work and go straight to the references and see how many of the references have been invented. I think, well, I just try to make it into a question or point. The question is, well, actually, there's something in The Guardian quite recently about maybe we need to, at higher education level, change the way we assess, because are we really producing the kind of graduate who did the work? And that sort of putting them, I mean, this actually dovetails with the point on CVs. And is this significant? How significant is it, and what can we do about it?
I can talk about the CV part. So we've had to completely change how we assess technical skills. We used to have coding challenges. There's no point, because they just use LLMs to write the code for them now, which we can generally spot. But we've had to completely change how we assess technical skills, which is why we now look for GitHubs, because we can see how often you've committed what you've put on there and how you've done that. And that's much better than asking people to do coding challenges, because they don't cheat. They just get the LLMs to write, and we'd rather not use LLMs for them. Code writing, please.
Also found the follow-up questions very helpful during the interviews, because the code, some of them were perfect, but the very next follow-up question, boom, that was it. You can see that they're struggling to answer their simplest questions. So it's very unlikely that they did the code. Nothing against them, but it was very unlikely that they did that.
The stats graduate who couldn't tell me the difference between the mean and the median didn't get very far. Yes, so you were going to say? Amy, you got one?
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of students. I think we somehow need to convince the students that it's worth doing the work themselves. And using, I can see it's useful to use AI as a tool. I can see that it improves the students' English a lot, for example, when they're writing. And that's useful. And that's maybe a good way of using it, because well, maybe not if you're in an English department, but in the maths department, fair enough. But what we don't want them to do is to let the AI do all the critical thinking for their own work, because then they're never going to learn to do it themselves. And I don't really know how we get to that point.
No, I'm with you. My son's English improved immeasurably by the ability to actually have a starting point from an LLM. So I will say that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very, very much to our speakers, and thank you for coming and asking such insightful questions. And I will hand over to Rob to close us off for the evening.
I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for taking the time to come here today. And thank you to yourselves as well for attending and actually engaging with the session. It's without you that we can't run these sessions, if nobody shows up. So what we'd really like, there we go. If you could send the QR code and just give us a quick bit of feedback and just say that, what you enjoyed, what you didn't, anything we can do better. That means we can improve these sessions for the future. So we will be back with the EICC Live. There'll be another session coming up soon, so check our What's On page for that. But yeah, once again, thank you very much and have a good evening.